In the following presentation, Professor Jeannette Littlemore, Professor of Applied Linguistics at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom, talks about the idea of embodied metaphor. She explains how words, images, or sounds can trigger physical and emotional responses in our brains, and suggests that such associations can vary across individuals of different gender and cultural and linguistic backgrounds.
Today I'm going to focus on this idea of embodied metaphor, and the idea that embodied metaphor is something that's meant to be thought to be universal, but also exhibits a lot of variation across different individuals, and I'm going to be looking at three ways in which it varies. But before going on to the talk, I'm going to give a definition of what I mean by embodied metaphor. I've got an example. I did some work with a colleague of mine in the business school at Birmingham, and we've been looking at the ways in which people who work in the civil service in the UK, so quite high up civil servants, talk about their jobs, in particular the way in which they evaluate their jobs. And in our data, we had this excellent quote from one of the civil servants who was talking about the frustrations he experiences when he's trying to get his day-to-day work done. And he said this: "I'm running on this soapy conveyor belt with people throwing wet sponges at me, and I've got this sodding great elastic band attached to my back." So I think we've all had moments a bit like this, yeah? So in other words, I'm trying to get my work done, I'm running on this conveyor belt, it's pushing me back at the same time and I'm running against it. This elastic band is pulling me back, there's soap all over it, and it's kind of like, I'm going to fall off it at any moment. Obviously he's not having a good day at work, this civil servant. This is an example of an embodied metaphor. So basically what you've got here is a really strong, really visceral bodily experience, a very physical experience, to describe something that's just kind of like quite abstract and quite difficult to get a handle of. People sometimes talk about using embodied metaphor as a device that people use to express something which other people haven't experienced, but they have experienced very, very strongly, and they want to get that experience across to other people. At its very core, there's been a lot of studies showing that this metaphor actually triggers physical responses in the brain. So as we pictured the man on the conveyor belt being pulled back by the elastic band, in order to understand that, according to quite a lot of research, we will have simulated that same experience in our minds. And what's very, very interesting is if we conduct a brain scan of people while we're hearing metaphors like this, actually what is triggered is the same parts of the brain that are activated if we were doing those movements ourselves. They are the same parts of the brain that are activated when we hear or read about people doing these kind of things. It's a bit like, you know, when you see somebody yawn, you have the urge to do a big yawn and everybody starts in the whole room. It's that kind of phenomenon. These literal and figurative correspondences, so grasp the handle of something to hold it very tightly, and grasp the concept, so that's the metaphorical extension of that. The same with kick a ball and kick a habit. Both of those have been shown to stimulate the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. So, in other words, trigger the parts of the brain that are involved in processing movement and senses, even when they're metaphorical. So, if we look at that, go right to the neurological level, there's not necessarily a difference between literal and metaphorical with these actions. And the same with she had a rough day versus she had a bad day. Both more or less equivalent responses, so the guy on the conveyor belt, but with had a rough day, when people are put in MRI scanners and they're played sentences like this, the part of the brain that would be activated if you were experiencing roughness is actually activated by the metaphor. And I think this is really interesting because this is why one reason why metaphor works, because it triggers these responses. Bad day doesn't trigger any of those kinds of responses. So it's much stronger. And it's the reason why we use metaphor so much in advertising and the rest of it. There are hundreds of studies looking at embodied metaphor from psycholinguistics. Here I've got just 4 examples of the sorts of studies. And these are the kinds of studies that are cited in the psycholinguistics literature very regularly to support this idea of embodied metaphor. The first one is this idea that importance is weight. Yeah? So we talk about a weighty volume, something being a heavy topic, a lightweight topic. So if something is important, it's heavy. There has been a very interesting study by Schneider et al., where what they did was they gave different groups of people a great big book like this, okay, identical looking book, but for half the people in their study, inside the book there was a weight to make the book feel physically, literally heavier, and for half there was no weight. And they just asked them, you know, how important does this book look to you? And asked them to scale on a scale of 1 to 5. Those who were holding a heavy book were significantly more likely to say, yes, this looks like a very, very important book to me. So there is this interaction between the physical and the metaphorical idea of importance is weight. Same with resemblance. There's a very strong metaphor that resemblance is proximity, yeah? So this is a near equivalent. This colour is nearly this colour, yeah? Daniel Casasanto did a study where he presented people with pairs of words that were kind of similar-ish in meaning or related somehow, pride and duty, anger and meekness, which are kind of the opposite, and asked people to rate how close those words are in meaning. He tricked people. Sometimes the words were physically closer to each other on the screen. Sometimes they were physically further away on the screen. And again, he found an interaction that when the words are presented physically closer, people will say they are semantically closer. So again, a metaphor that is motivated by a kind of a physical response. Magnitude. This is quite a nice study, a couple of colleagues of mine. Very simple study where they just asked people to look up or look down, half people looking up, half people looking down, and think of a number between 1 and 20. Yeah? And you can probably guess what I'm going to say. The people looking up were more likely to come up with a high number, and the people looking down with a low number. The fourth one I really like. This final study by Littlemore. 2 groups of people were invited into a room. Half the participants were read a story about a very moral deed. Somebody had done the right kind of thing, very responsible actions, etc. The other half were read a story where people had done something really immoral and really naughty and really wrong. And then after the study, they were offered a present, a kind of thank you present for participating in the study. They could either have some chocolate or something like that, or they could have some antiseptic wipes. I don't know what would make people do this, but the people who had heard the immoral story were significantly more likely to select the antiseptic wipes to clean themselves. So this is kind of, again, this interaction between the metaphorical and the physical. Really, really strong. Hundreds of these studies, great fun studies to read about. There's also a lot of gestural support for the idea that metaphor is embodied. So if we have expressions like this, like fit in, yeah? When we're teaching these to students, often we teach them like, you know, as a phrasal verb, an unmotivated expression, that's just the way we say it. But if you look at the way people gesture when they use expressions like this, often the gesture will go back to the basic sense of the word. So here she is fitting in, even though there's no actual physical inness going on, but there is in her hands, yeah. And there's loads and loads of work in gesture studies in support of this idea of embodied metaphor. And these are some of the kinds of things that people have identified. So change is motion. These are the things that people gesture. Organisation is physical structure. Yeah. Emotional intimacy is proximity. Precision is tightness. So we see all these kind of gestures every day. There's been studies showing that people are using gesture in order to help frame our thoughts, particularly embodied metaphorical thoughts, to put our thoughts into words. Also a very interesting study by Jeannette and Tversky. In English, we have this kind of ambiguity. So we have the kind of the time is movement forward in space metaphor. And we can say, next Wednesday's meeting has been moved forward by 2 days. Now, in English, that can either mean that it's going to be on Friday, or it can mean that it's going to be on Monday. And what they did in their study was they had half the participants in the room, in their study, were asked to close their eyes, and the other half kept their eyes open. And as the person's been moving forward, he just gestured like this, yeah? And then the other half of the participants, the gesture was like this. And of course, these participants saw it as Friday, these participants saw it as Monday. Yeah, very simple thing. But it shows that we pay attention to the metaphors in the gesture as well as the metaphors in the language. And I think for us as teachers, that's quite important. We need to be careful what we're doing with our hands because people are learning from them, I think. And so there are studies that show that if there's an incongruency between the language and the gesture, it disrupts thought patterns. Coming back to some of the claims that have been made about this, this is the big proponents of this idea of embodied metaphor, 2 of them, Lakoff and Johnson. And they say, if you are a normal human being, you inevitably acquire an enormous range of primary metaphors, by which they mean basically these embodied metaphors, just by going about the world constantly moving and perceiving. Okay, fair enough, except for I have a problem, I have an issue with this word, normal. I'm not sure if I'm a normal to you, I'm sure I'm not. I'm sure none of us are, actually. Yeah, it's a big claim to make. So I'm going to be looking at which metaphors are embodied and when, because I think it's not just like variation across individuals, it's also some metaphors are going to be embodied some of the time. It's not going to be that every single metaphor creates some kind of embodied response every single time we hear it. Otherwise, we'd just be we'd be a mess. We'd be constantly reacting in a physical way to everything that we hear. So what does it actually mean in practice? And I would say that the idea operates at 3 different levels, or there's kind of a cline of levels. So you've got this kind of very neurological response, kind of like a metaphor that triggers a physical response in the mind, an action or an emotion, etc. Or moving along the cline, it could just be that in order to understand the metaphor, we just activate just our knowledge of our bodies, but we don't actually physically experience the metaphor when we hear it. Or it could just be that it's a kind of idiomatic language and we're used to that kind of language and that we hear it and we're just exposed to it. And a lot of the literature shown that the metaphors that are most likely to trigger this embodied response are ones that are novel, ones that involve emotion, ones that are about emotion and senses, ones that are presented from the perspective of the listener. So if it's presented from our own perspective, we're more likely to physically experience it. And if it's foregrounded, and often it's foregrounded in all sorts of ways, people draw attention to it, particularly perhaps through gesture, as we can see in this example. This is an example from some data of mine where a lecturer is talking to a student about ways in which businesses operate. And she's talking about big companies as playing the piano. She just plucks this out of nowhere. This is the left hand of the piano, keeping the old beat going and the keys going. And this could be the fancy fiddly bits on the right-hand side, on the right hand of the piano, high notes. And she's doing this. So it's interesting here because she's involving 2 metaphors. So she's got this kind of like resemblance metaphor of the piano going on, but also this kind of like embodied thing of like high and low notes. That's something I'll come back to. That is also a cultural thing. It's not a universal thing, the idea that notes can be high and they can be low. In some cultures, they can be thick and thin to describe the same phenomenon. So it's not necessarily a core thing. But it's quite interesting. So this is sort of foregrounding the embodied metaphor. And there's some really very nice work by Cornelia Muller and Suzanne Tag. They talk about this activated metaphristion. I like this idea. Like the metaphors are kind of there, all trundling along all the time. But every now and then we can wake one up and do something with it and bring it to life. So now I'm coming to the core of my talk, which is about variation across individuals. So we go back to these guys with our normal human beings. There are also other quotes in their other book. They talk about a prototypical person or normal conceptual system or natural kinds of experience. Again, very normative kind of ideas. Not much room for variation here. Here are 3 examples just straight off the bat of ways in which there is variation. So there is a metaphor very strong in English, and I'm sure it's in lots of languages, where because people are right-handed, right things tend to be good, yeah? Things are right, for example, yeah, as opposed to like people being a bit gauche, which is French for left, or maybe sinister, which is the Latin for left. So good is right, bad is left is a general metaphor we have in English, and I think probably in a lot of cultures. Daniel Casasanto has done some very nice work, a very interesting study where he asked participants to imagine that they were going to a zoo, and at the zoo there were some lions and there were some zebras. And he said, here are 2 cages at the zoo. Imagine you really like the lions and you really hate the zebras. Just draw them in whichever cage they're going to be in. He found, interestingly, that right-handed people significantly will always put the animal that they like on the right. Very, very, not always, but very, very often. Left-handed people, significantly less likely to do so. So they've got a combination of embodiment and culture coming in here. Religious beliefs. My student Peter Richardson was doing some work with Christians and Muslims talking about this journey metaphor, which is very, very common in Christianity, going on a journey through life. And he found that in his dialogues, there was a difference between the Christians and the Muslims in that the Christians were going on a journey with God, whereas the Muslims, it was very often a journey towards God. And it's very interesting that even within that one kind of embodied moving through life metaphor, you've got variation across the different religions. And Andreas Mussolf has done a whole heap of work on cultural and linguistic background and how that changes people's approaches to metaphor. And I'm going to talk about some of that a bit later on in the talk, as long as some of our own work. I've just finished writing a book about all these sources of variation. I'm just going to go through the top 3. And I've chosen these because they're 3 very, very different ways in which it varies. So gender. I just want to start by showing you a little diagram here. So out of these 2 people, which one would you say has more power? The king, yeah, okay, straightforward, easy, yeah, no problem at all. So now which one has got more power? In theory, it's still the king, but the servant's now at the top of the screen, so we pause a little bit. And this is what Schubert found in his study, that when you present these roles at the top or the bottom of a computer screen and you say which one has got more power, people take significantly longer to decide when it's the wrong way round. Yeah, yeah. Because we've got this idea of the hierarchy. It's a physical hierarchy, a very strong embodied metaphor. What we did in our study was we factored gender into this, because there's also, this idea of the hierarchy, but also I wonder if men should be at the top and women should be at the bottom, because that's the way hierarchies tend to work. So we introduced gender into it. And then the same study, the reaction times, etc., did gender make a difference to people's views? So in a way, we've got 4 combinations. We've got the kind of the hierarchy thing with teacher and pupil. Then we've got the male and female. This is the most congruent. But then you can have male pupil, female teacher. So all those different crossovers. So we crossed all of these things and put them all into the model and did the statistics. And found that, unfortunately, yes, gender does make a difference. People respond quicker when women are at the bottom than when men are at the bottom. Sensory metaphor and synesthesia. I don't know if you're familiar with the phenomenon of synesthesia. It's kind of like the opposite of a sensory deficit. It's like a sensory surplus. People are automatically trigger all sorts of cross-sensory responses to stimuli. They're spontaneous. People can't stop having them. Here's an example from a novel which is set in Birmingham, Astonishing Splashes of Colour. It's about a woman who has synesthesia. And here's the woman talking about a man she sees when she goes to the school playground to pick up her daughter. And she has very strong feelings about this man. She says, "There are only certain times when I feel right, he feels right. Then his white slows down so that all the yellows and blues and reds in his spectrum meet mine and merge, complementing the frenetic whirls of colour inside me. We look at each other and we match. Things can only work if we share the colours out properly, evenly between us." One thing that is interesting about synesthetes is neurological research shows that there are very, very strong connections between the sensory cortex, so the part of the brain responsible for triggering the senses and appreciating the senses, and the amygdala, which is responsible for emotions and emotional content. So senses and emotions come together very strongly. And I think that also comes together very strongly in embodied metaphor, which is why we thought we'd look at these individuals. So we were interested in looking at how synesthetes differ from non-synesthetes in terms of their responses to their formulation of cross-sensory metaphor, their response to it and their production. So we did a very small exploratory study, 20 synesthetes, 20 non-synesthetes, gathered from these groups. We showed them expressions like this. So the sound of fingernails and short balls set my teeth on edge. Seeing those people, again, made my skin crawl, made me feel sick, left a bad taste in my mouth. So these are very idiomatic expressions, very set expressions. And we just, very simple question, how literal is this expression for you? And we found that for the synesthetes, they're very much more literal. So these are kind of like these embodied metaphors are more embodied in a way for the synesthetes than they are for the non-synesthetes, significantly so. Then we also gave them a very simple task where we said to them, just tell us about something you really, really love to see, something you hate to see, and then all the other senses as well. And we collected the data into a mini corpus and analysed the corpus for the kinds of responses that people came up with, the kind of metaphors that they produced. And a few interesting findings that we made. The synesthetes' responses were significantly more, well, we label it creative. Creativity is a difficult thing because you don't know how much conscious requirement there needs to be for something to be creative. But to us, they looked creative. We've got things like this. So I don't like some kind of Hershey's chocolate because they taste of how ripped up tyres look. So it's quite interesting. So you've got this taste and look crossing over here. Stepped on a pile of wood grubs that were under a piece of wood. They poured like tiny balloons filled with mashed potatoes. I only felt the sensation of them popping my through, but it almost made me throw up. I rarely get nauseous from something like that. So these are really, really, really strong cross-sensory. For me, these are very metaphorical and very embodied responses to these objects. They were also much more emotional. I like this one. I don't like to look at baby carrots for too long. They remind me of obesity. They're too smooth. I do not like the little ridges. I'm not joking. Sometimes the images of carrots keep me up at night. It's been the way since I was little. I was always afraid of becoming fat, and I guess it manifests itself in the texture of baby. There's an interesting combination here of like this externalization of these internal processes. Involve the conflation of several senses. So you've got his voice melts my mind, it makes me warm, it looks like deep dark colours is my favourite sound. So you've got kind of physical thing making me warm, but also what it looks like, both triggered by the sound. Activation of colours. Vacuums make me see so much red it's actually a little uncomfortable. And the flute. I don't like how airy it is. I get lightheaded thinking about it. The colour of the sound is a kind of terribly obnoxious baby blue. The thing is with these, like they sound like they're unusual, but they kind of make sense. I know exactly what she means by that blue. It's all light and fluffy, but it's a bit sort of grating at some level. A lot of personification of the objects. Waves seem angry and I don't trust them. Lemons need to chill out. Eggs and cheese feels fake. Water which is flavoured but only slightly. Are you water? Are you flavoured water? Pick something. So, which one are you going to be? And empathy. So once the objects have been personified, there can be empathy with the objects. And this person talks about the reason this is enjoyable is it helps me empathise with things. So things you wouldn't even know about, so like street lines, beehives, computer monitors, etc. Getting empathy with these things. And then finally, juxtaposition of abstract and concrete phenomena. So pickled beets taste like death, raw mushrooms are like eating sliced sponges, and cooked mushrooms taste like slimy slugs. So again, you've got this abstract and phenomena. And then my final favourite one, those cookies tasted of regret and rotting flesh. Okay? So again, you've got the abstract and the concrete. So their experiences of embodied metaphor are very, very, very different from the experiences that people without synesthesia have. So this is another challenge to this idea that embodied metaphor is this kind of uniform, universal thing. Finally, cultural and linguistic background. There have been a number of studies showing that actually, these things are not necessarily universal across cultures. There have been some quite nice studies. This is a study by Lera Boroditsky, looking at differences cross-linguistically and cross-culturally in the way some embodied metaphors work. So in English, we've got this idea of moving forward in time is moving across space like this, yeah, from left to right. In Chinese, there is this as well, but I think it can also be top to bottom, yeah. And she did a very simple study where she showed things like, this is an example of different stages of eating a banana, okay? There are lots of these kinds of pictures, and she might ask people to say, is this before or after? So she would show people one after another. And for some of the participants, they were asked to indicate on the keyboard with the left and right, and other people were asked to indicate with the up and down keys. And she found that for the Chinese-speaking participants, the up and down, they were much quicker to react than when it was the left to the right. And the English were quicker to react to the left and the right than the up and the down, showing that there's, again, this kind of like this motor response. So the language has kind of got into our muscles in a way, and it affects the way we respond. Interesting study. This is Andreas Mussel, who I mentioned before. We have this idea of like nation as a body in English, and we talk about kind of like, the queen is the head of the nation, and then the people are kind of like the body, and the feet might be the workers, etc. He gave this to people from across the world and asked them what they made of the body. And the respondents from mainland China had a very different approach to this. They would say things like, the heart and the brain is Beijing, which is kind of like a metonymy there for what goes on in Beijing. The face is Shanghai. The eyes are Shenzhen. It's interesting because it's the same embodied metaphor, but it's a different angle on it, a different way of seeing it. Rather than seeing it as for society, it's like a geographical way of working with that metaphor. So it's the same thing, but again, varied across cultures. So in the spirit of the cross-cultural variation, we did a study, so we were interested in word-colour associations. So there are a lot of word-colour associations that are very, very embodied. So, for example, when we talk about that red, it meaning angry, yeah? Or red meaning passionate. That's because people go red when they're angry or when they are passionate. On the other hand, we have things like green with envy. It's difficult to work out what the physical motivation is for green with envy. That's a very different sort of thing. So we're interested in looking at how these vary across cultures and whether the embodied level of the relationship has any effect on people's responses. So we have these expressions, you know, like a black sheep, feeling blue, green with envy, etc. And then we also have these more subtle, nuanced associations of these kinds of words, not just emotions, but also kind of other things like balance or tastes as well that we associate with words or activities. And we are looking at, so what motivates these word-colour associations? So it could be the bodily basis, yeah? Could be just cultural conventions. It could just be the linguistic environment. You know, so there's these three, again across these Klein, from like pure, raw, embodied stuff right through to the linguistic environment. And so basically we had 3 mini-studies that are all related. And in the first study, we were just looking at, are there differences between the ways in which people associate words and colours? Here, in our 2 groups of participants were people in Hong Kong answering the questionnaire in Cantonese and people in the UK answering the question in English. And we had them do things like this. So you've got the word angry. Which of these colours do you associate it with? Okay, very simple stuff. In study 2, we were getting more into the kind of what is the universality of the strength of association related to its bodily basis. So is it that if you've got a strong physical basis for word colour association, are more people likely to make that association? Is it going to be a stronger association? So will more people go for things like angry is red than jealous is green? So here, in addition to the first survey, we added in a second survey where we asked people to motivate the physical origin of an expression. So we've got something like energetic is orange. Has that got a physical thing, or is it more just a kind of like a linguistic thing? And in study 3, I put second language because I know that in the Hong Kong context it's extremely complex, but bilingual speakers in Hong Kong, when they're answering the survey in English, you've got a choice there. So I think one of the interesting ones that came up was erotic, came up as yellow, yeah? Now that's a very kind of Chinese, Cantonese type association. For the English it came up as red. So for me, the red one seems to be the more embodied one. The yellow one is harder to work out what the motivation is for that. It's like a cultural thing. So will people move towards the more embodied thing? Because you've got the choice. With the bilingual mind, you've got the choice of different kinds of options. So does embodiment pull people in one direction when there's a difference between the 2 languages? So basically we found, so the first study, in what way do they vary? Here it's just sort of examples of the types of variation. So we found a lot of congruence. Actually, these things you'd expect, yeah? This is a lot of agreement. Angry, dangerous, furious. Pretty strong agreement there. Old, grey and brown, yeah? Safe, green, yeah? So these are kind of the pretty similar across the two languages. Same types of associations, but in different order. So interestingly, in Hong Kong, orange is more happy, and in Britain, yellow is more happy. Red appears in Hong Kong, but not in the UK. Sad, again, same words, but different order. This is one that shows it very, very different. Erotic, completely different there. But purple comes up for some reason. Jealous, interesting, because I think this is perhaps the green is coming from the envy idea, yeah? Whereas it's very much red in Cantonese. And then purple. And then salty. Interestingly, it's brown in Cantonese, white in English, but then we were saying, well, this is probably because of soy sauce, yeah? Rather than salt, yeah? So to what extent does the level of agreement correlate with its perceived bodily basis? We found very strong, significant correlations here. So basically, in both languages, there was very strong agreement. You can see here, this is in the Cantonese respondents. So down here is kind of low embodiment and low association. And here, high embodiment, high association. Got things like furious is red, very embodied, very associated. A few outliers. New is white, so very embodied, but not necessarily strongly associated. Same with passion is red for some reason. I think what's here is this being interfered with by the erotic is yellow thing, I think, possibly. There's competing correspondences. The same with the English participants. Dangerous is red, very strong. Outliers, depressed is grey, so embodied but not necessarily strongly associated. Jealous is green. You've got that from the idiom. So you've got these competing things feeding into this. And so the final thing, when speaking the second language, are bilingual speakers more likely to adopt physically based word co-associations than culturally based ones? Basically, the short answer is yes, they were. So basically, when there was a kind of choice between the two, if it was more embodied in English, people would move towards that. If it was more embodied in Cantonese, they would move towards that. These are examples. So retained embodied Cantonese style associations. Comfortable is green. This is really interesting because when it came up with comfortable is green, I thought, that's really weird. Why on earth is comfortable green? In the UK, our comfortable is more about orange and red and cosy, and probably because it's such a horrible cold country that we need to be indoors. Yeah. Fearful is black, stable is blue, retained. Things that were dropped. So salty is brown. So when people are doing this questionnaire in Hong Kong in Cantonese, salty will be brown. When they're doing it in English, salty becomes white. Grown is blue, was dropped. In favour of grown is green. I'm not sure about why the reasons for that. Erotic is no longer yellow when people are speaking Cantonese. When they're speaking English, it becomes red. And they didn't adopt things like this. So things like jealousy is green, comfortable is purple, difficult to see an embodiment, these are less likely to be adopted. So I think the sort of like the take-home message from this is that people, as well as the kind of like the linguistic input, there's also an embodied input going on as well that is pulling people in one direction or another. The conclusions from this study are that bodily-based associations are more universal, more likely to be adopted by second language speakers, as well as the kind of linguistic knowledge. There's all this kind of conceptual knowledge going on behind the scenes, all these associations that may not actually ever be particularly voiced, but they are working behind the scenes to shape the way in which people work with the language. Why does any of this matter? Final slide. I think people do experience the world in different ways through metaphors. So we might think that we've all got the same bodies, therefore the same metaphors. That's not the case. Differences operate even at the most very, very basic levels of understanding, conceptual as well as linguistic. And all these implications, I think, social, political, diplomatic, educational, interpersonal, for anything where people are coming into communication with one another and we think we're understanding each other, even on, at a very, very basic level, even very, very small level, we think we're understanding, we're not always understanding. So we may often think we're using a metaphor to think in the same way and to trigger the same associations when in fact we are not. And thank you to everybody who's involved in the study. And thank you.